Okay, welcome back. We'll go over a couple of slides and then we will continue with the marking, and I'll give you time to work on your chapter questions. I will try to finish this chapter this week. We are going to skip chapter 2 quiz. Chapter 3, we are having a project. Okay, so we'll try to get a lot of that done because when we come back from break, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, we're in the lab. So that means I got a lot of teaching to do, so I can't spend 20 minutes on one slide. Okay, minority groups. Okay, minority means these smaller, right? Dealing with when you live in a globalized world, a world where it's very easy for movement, migration, travel. Where's your notes?
I don't know where they are.
Oh, it's gonna be a tough chapter for you, hey? Okay. When you have all these groups that are able to move freely and easily, you're gonna have areas where you'll have minority groups. And you know, obviously that would have happened historically as well, right? Even if you were to look at the history of Canada, look at the indigenous history, not all those tribes are gonna have equal amounts of people. Some tribes will have more or less. Those numbers can fluctuate on a number of things, right? How resilient a group of people is to disease, how effective they are at getting food, how well they distribute, you know, particularly before modern agriculture, how well they distribute those nutrients across their community as well, how effective they are at warfare, right? Because I was just reading an Instagram post about this. Just, you know, prior to agriculture, prior to people actually growing food rather than hunting it, it was very common for groups of people to just go around, violently kill all the men in one group, and then, you know, enslave all the women, or take all the women, right? That was a very common practice prior to people growing food, agriculture. And then once humans started growing their own food, and you could then stockpile wealth and resources, which, you know, only exacerbated that problem, according to what I was reading the other day. Okay. Anyways, minority groups are just a smaller group within a larger society. So, for example, let's say like you're the only one wearing like a pinkish piece of clothing. So in terms of clothing, you know, minority group. Most of us are either wearing black, white, or gray. Clearly that's the majority group. We have some green back there. Are you also wearing green? Kind of green, no? Okay, that looks like dark gray. Something, I don't know. Why are you making that face? Maybe I'm a little colorblind, you never know. Okay, there's only one person wearing like a green sweatshirt, another one-ish, right? So those are minority groups. Well, sometimes minority groups, they separate themselves from mainstream culture. And then we have up here, multicolored sweater, and, you know, very unique, right? Right? So this can open these groups to discrimination, racism, and alienation, right? So the only person who's potentially wearing, you know, 3 colors in one article of clothing, right? Except for Mr. Bob Marley's shirt over here, right? But, you know, sometimes when you're too far out from the norm, from whatever whatever we're accustomed to, it can be pretty common human behavior to alienate that. It's just too different from who or what you are. It's too difficult to comprehend, let's say, or understand. Now, in a globalizing world, you can get more access to these groups that are very different, right? Doesn't necessarily mean that they'll be accepted into the majority, but, you know, you can be more aware of these different groups, right, without naming them. Sometimes groups of people will do this to themselves. So I know in Edmonton there are certain parts of the city, certain neighborhoods where you might see more of certain ethnic groups. Okay, I know there's a large Arab community in Northside Edmonton. I don't know, I just don't know the demographics of Leduc. And Leduc's a newer community, so maybe people are more mixed in. But when communities, over time, eventually you'll start to see people congregate, right? And, you know, it kind of makes sense. You're likely going to be friends with people that you get along with, and maybe you get along with people for a variety of reasons. And you know, if you had a choice to be in a classroom with them, maybe you'd pick those people all the time, so you'd always be in your group, right? You know, there's a question there we can ask, but we'll just skip over that. Okay. Well, there's another case study. We'll go back to this. I just want to get through some more slides. Okay. Language then plays a big role in how you, you know, interact with the world as well. So, you know, for many of us, we're actually quite fortunate that we speak English. I don't know if you kids have traveled extensively, but I'm very fortunate to have done so in my life. And basically every country I've gone to, I found at least one person who spoke English, right? Or at least one person who could speak broken English or was trying to speak some sort of English. Like I remember when I was in Japan, some very kind, helpful Japanese people tried their best to help me and point out directions and use the small little bits of English that they had to communicate with me, right? So if you don't speak a language, you know, you become to some extent alienated, right? You can't really communicate. And that was kind of the inverse, the opposite of Japanese culture. One thing that we were told by many people was that in Japanese culture, they'll probably kind of keep you on the outside if you can't interact with them in their language. But once, this is what I learned from people who are trying to speak and learn Japanese, once you start learning their language and start approaching them in their language, they really start to embrace, to some extent, the fact that you're trying to become part of their culture as well, right? And so language can create a real big barrier. So that's why, you know, for some people, language is very important to preserve that, right? Particularly for the French, the Quebecois people in Canada. Having their minority language rights, to protect their language, protect their access to education in that language, maintains some sort of existence for their culture, right? So one thing we discuss with historical globalization, particularly with indigenous groups, is that many of them, you know, in residential schools, what were they not allowed to do?
Speak their language.
They're not allowed to speak their own language, which means that all of a sudden they can't communicate with who?
Their parents.
Their parents, brothers and sisters, their community at large, right? Now they're not quite part of their own community, but they're visibly not quite part of the community they were trying to be, you know, assimilated into, right? And so that creates barriers. Out of curiosity, does anyone speak more than English at home? Okay. Does anyone, so in my own scenario, I speak English to my parents and they speak Urdu to me. Anyone in a similar scenario, you speak English to your parents and, yeah? What language do you speak at home? Zulu. That's from, okay, interesting. What about you?
I speak Czech.
You speak Czech?
Yeah.
Okay, so you speak Czech to your parents?
Not so much, but to my grandparents or.
Okay. Do your parents speak in Czech to you?
Only my dad's not Czech, but my mom not really, here and there.
Okay. Someone else had their hand up back there. Okay.
Every now and then to call somebody out for something, just throw some German, Russian, anything I could think of at the
Throw in
moment.
some swears?
Yeah.
Okay. And so, you know, for those of us who maybe have access to a different language, whether from grandparents or parents, you know, we likely weren't formally educated in that language. Did you get any Zulu education? You did? Interesting. Like from your parents or?
No, school.
Okay, cool. Right, so having that access to language, it maintains part of your identity as well, right? Oh, so this first point just kind of speaks to the fact that if you speak English in an English-speaking country, you might not necessarily tie that into your identity until you're put into an environment where your knowledge of English doesn't help you, right? Let's say if you go to some parts of Asia or South America, for sure South America. When I was in Ecuador visiting my brother, like nobody spoke English, right? So now it's like, oh, all this skill and mastery I have in this language is useless. Then it really hits you like, well, English is a part of my identity because I can't speak Spanish. or whatever language happens to be. Okay. So again, looking at that historical identity of Canada, we have, or we at one point we had a very large variety of Aboriginal languages that are divided into 11 different language groups. And it's quite interesting because a lot of these indigenous communities would have their own sort of unique dialect as well. So they would, refer to certain things in their own specific way. So the same animal, a bison, might be called something slightly different depending on the group, depending on the region of North America that they were in. And the fascinating part about that is that although it is most often accepted that human beings migrated across from like northern Russia over to Alaska, coming down about 12,000 years ago, when you look at the linguistic diversity, the language diversity, because there's so many different dialects spoken, I was listening to a podcast, this indigenous guy was saying, it's evidence that suggests that maybe these people were here a lot longer than we think, right? Which is entirely possible. It can be very hard to understand those dates, particularly if people don't have very large structures that they built, or Another complication with the history of North America is that where we are, about 12,000 years ago, there used to be 2 to 3, 4 kilometers thick ice, right? Like